Open a Bible. Any Bible. Turn to Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Read the passage where Eve takes the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Read it slowly. Read every word. Now ask yourself a question that 2 billion Christians have been trained never to ask. Where does it say apple? It doesn't. The word apple does not appear in the book of Genesis, not in the Hebrew original, not in the earliest Greek translations, not in any manuscript that predates the 4th century. The fruit that Eve takes from the tree, the single most consequential act in the foundational narrative of Western civilization, the moment that introduces sin, death, shame, and exile into the human story, is described in the original Hebrew with one word, peri, fruit, generic, unspecified, deliberately unnamed fruit. Not apple, not fig, not grape, not pomegranate. Peri. A word so deliberately vague that it functions less as a botanical description and more as a refusal to describe, as if the original authors understood that the identity of the fruit was not the point, as if naming it would diminish it, as if the power of the story lay precisely in the not knowing. And then someone named it. And once it was named, everything the story originally meant began to collapse into a single, manageable image. A red fruit, a woman's hand, a serpent, a picture so simple that a child could understand it, and so reductive that the original meaning was buried beneath it for 1,600 years. The deeper I went into how that happened, the more I found something far more disturbing than a mistranslation. I found a pattern. Start with what the original text actually says, because what it says is stranger and richer and more dangerous than anything the apple ever allowed it to be. The Hebrew Bible describes 2 trees at the center of the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The fruit of the second tree is the one that is forbidden. The Hebrew phrase is etz hada'at tov wa ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, not the tree of sin, not the tree of temptation, the tree of knowledge. The thing that was forbidden was not a fruit, it was what the fruit contained, knowledge, the capacity to perceive the difference between good and evil, the ability to see what God sees, to know what God knows. The text is explicit. God tells Adam that on the day he eats from this tree, he will die. The serpent tells Eve the opposite. You will not die. Your eyes will be opened. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. Eve looks at the tree. She sees that it is good for food, pleasant to the eyes, and desirable for making one wise. She takes the fruit and eats it. She gives it to Adam. He eats. Their eyes are opened. They know they are naked. They cover themselves. This is the text. This is what the original Hebrew says. And nowhere in it, at any point, in any verse, does the word apple appear. The Hebrew word for apple, tapuach, appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in the Song of Solomon, in the book of Joel, but it never appears in Genesis. The omission is not accidental. The omission is the point. This raises a simple but critical question. If the Bible never says apple, who put it there? The trail leads to one man and one translation. In the year 382, Pope Damasus commissioned a scholar named Jerome to translate the Bible from its original Hebrew and Greek into Latin, the common language of the Western Roman Empire. Jerome spent nearly 15 years on the project. The result was the Vulgate, the Latin Bible that would become the foundational text of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. Every priest, every monk, every theologian, every illiterate peasant who heard Scripture read aloud in a medieval church, all of them received the Bible through Jerome's Latin. And in Jerome's Latin, something happened to the tree. The phrase, etz hada'at tov wa ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, became lignum scientiae boni et mali, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The critical word is mali. It is the genitive form of malum, which in Latin means evil. But malum in Latin has a second meaning. Apple. Two unrelated words, two different etymologies, two different pronunciations, one with a long vowel and one with a short vowel. But on paper, in written Latin, they look identical. Malum, evil, malum, apple, the tree of the knowledge of good, and mali, the tree of the knowledge of good and apples. The pun was there. Whether Jerome intended it, whether he noticed it, whether he considered its implications, we do not know. What we know is what happened next, because what happened next is one of the most consequential acts of visual interpretation in the history of the Western world. Artists painted it, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. The medieval and Renaissance artists who depicted the Garden of Eden needed a visual shorthand. They needed to show the fruit. And the Latin text gave them a word that could mean two things, and one of those things was a real, holdable, paintable object. Albrecht Dürer engraved Adam and Eve in 1504 with a perfect heavy apple in Eve's hand. Lucas Cranach the Elder painted the scene dozens of times across the early 16th century, always with apples dangling from the branches. Hugo van der Goes painted a panel around 1480 showing Eve reaching for an apple tree. And in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo painted the temptation scene between 1508 and 1512 with Eve receiving the fruit from a serpent coiled around a tree. Though in his case the tree appears to be a fig, one of the few Renaissance artists who resisted the apple tradition. But it was John Milton who sealed it permanently. In 1667, Milton published Paradise Lost, the most influential retelling of the Genesis story ever written in the English language. Milton was a Cambridge scholar fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He knew the original text said peri. He knew Jerome's translation used malum. He knew the pun. And he chose apple. He described its taste, its appearance, its seductive qualities. He wrote the apple into the English imagination so thoroughly that for 3.5 centuries afterward, no one questioned it. The apple became fact. The Bible said apple. Everyone knew that. Everyone was wrong. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, because the apple didn't just replace the unnamed fruit. It replaced every other interpretation that had existed for the 2,000 years before the Vulgate was written. Go look at the rabbinic commentary. The Jewish tradition that maintained the original Hebrew text never stopped debating what the fruit might have been, and their candidates are extraordinary. Rabbi Nehemiah Hayun argued it was a fig because immediately after eating the fruit, Adam and Eve sewed fig leaves to cover themselves. The logic is textual and elegant. The tree that caused the fall was the same tree that provided the remedy. You were brought low by the same thing that lifted you back up. The Talmud suggested it was a grape, and that the knowledge it conferred was the intoxicating, disorienting, consciousness-altering knowledge that wine produces. In this reading, the fruit didn't just teach good from evil, it made you see the world differently. It altered your mind. The Islamic tradition identified it as wheat, noting the linguistic connection in Hebrew between kita, wheat, and ket, sin. Some rabbinical commentators suggested it was an etrog, the citron used in the festival of Sukkot, a sacred fruit with deep ceremonial significance. Others proposed a carob, a nut, or something that has no modern equivalent at all. The pseudepigraphic Book of Enoch describes the tree of knowledge as resembling a tamarind bearing fruit that looked like fine grapes, with a fragrance that extended a considerable distance. The evidence suggests something much larger than a botanical debate, because each of these identifications carries a completely different theological meaning. If the fruit is a fig, the story is about shame and self-remedy. The source of your fall is the source of your healing. If it's a grape, the story is about intoxication, the dangerous allure of altered consciousness and the loss of clarity. If it's wheat, the story is about agriculture, the moment humans left the garden and entered the labor of farming, the sweat of your brow existence that agriculture demands. If it's something with no name, then the story is about the unknowable, about a kind of knowledge so dangerous that even its container cannot be identified. Each reading opens a door into a different understanding of what knowledge means, what temptation is, what the fall actually cost. The unnamed fruit was a vessel for infinite interpretation. Every generation could pour its own understanding into the void that the original text deliberately left open. The apple closed that void. The silence was deafening. Because here's what the apple does to the story. It makes it small. It makes it a fairy tale, a woman, a snake, a shiny red fruit, something a child can color in a Sunday school workbook, something you can hold in one hand and understand in one glance. The apple takes a text that was deliberately, carefully, architecturally designed to resist reduction and reduces it. It takes a story about the nature of knowledge itself, about the relationship between humans and the divine, about the cost of seeing clearly, and compresses it into an image so familiar, so domesticated, so perfectly manageable, that it no longer asks anything of the person encountering it. This raises a simple but critical question. Who benefits from a story that stops asking questions? I want to pause here and ask something that isn't usually asked. What does it do to a civilization when its foundational narrative is flattened? When a text that was written to be inexhaustible, to generate new meaning in every generation, to resist closure, is given a definitive visual answer that forecloses every other possibility. The Hebrew Bible said peri because peri means everything. The Vulgate's malum could mean two things. The Renaissance artist chose one, Milton confirmed it, and 2 billion people inherited a story that had been sealed shut. Not by theology, not by revelation, by a pun in a dead language and a painting in oil. The deeper I went, the more I found that this wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of translation narrowing meaning rather than preserving it. Every time a sacred text passes through a new language, decisions are made. Words that contain multitudes are compressed into words that contain specifics. Ambiguities that the original authors preserved on purpose, because the ambiguity was the teaching, are resolved by translators who assume the text needs to be clearer than it was written to be. The apple is just the most famous example. It is the moment where the Western world can watch, in real time across centuries, a deliberate openness being closed by the machinery of institutional transmission. The official explanation collapses here. We're told the apple was a harmless cultural tradition, a visual convention, an artistic choice that doesn't affect the meaning of the text, but it does affect the meaning. The unnamed fruit asks you to wonder. The apple tells you to stop wondering. The unnamed fruit preserves the mystery at the center of the story. The apple resolves it, and in resolving it, it removes the very thing that made the story sacred, its capacity to mean more than you can hold in one reading. Go read Genesis 3 again. Read it in a good English translation, one that says fruit and not apple. Read it as if you've never heard the story before. Read it without the image in your head, without the Renaissance painting, without the Sunday school coloring page, without Milton's descriptions of taste and fragrance. Read it with the void intact, with the unnamed fruit hanging on the unnamed tree, with the knowledge of good and evil waiting inside something that the text refuses to show you. What do you see? What does the story become when the fruit has no face? What does the fall mean when you can't picture the thing that caused it? I don't have a complete theory. I have a question that multiplies the deeper I look. Why did a text that was written in deliberate ambiguity get resolved into a single image? Why did the richest, most debated, most theologically productive mystery in the Hebrew Bible get replaced by a fruit that grows in English orchards? Why did 2,000 years of rabbinic interpretation, each candidate fruit carrying a different theological universe inside it, get overwritten by a Latin pun and a Renaissance painting? Why did the institution that claims to guard the Word of God allow the word to be narrowed beyond recognition. I'll leave you with this. The next time you see a painting of the Garden of Eden, an apple in Eve's hand, a serpent in the branches, ask yourself who put the apple there. Not the painter. Before the painter. Who decided that a story about the most dangerous knowledge in the universe could be held in the palm of one hand? Who decided that a narrative designed to be bottomless needed a floor? Because the original text had no floor. The original text said fruit and nothing more. It left a silence at the center of the most important story ever told, a silence shaped exactly like a question. And for 2,000 years, every culture that encountered that silence filled it with something different: a fig, a grape, a citron, a tamarind, wheat, wine, something with no name. Then someone filled it with an apple, and the question stopped. Not because it was answered, because no one could see past the apple that it had ever been asked.